Thank you for tuning in to Before You Build. I'm Brandon Holland, Senior Sales Manager with the ARIID Build.
And I'm Ariana Adireh Anderson, head designer, CEO. So welcome to our topic. Today we're going to talk about ADUs and DADUs. So let's start off.
Yeah, so I mean, it's genuinely the most frequently question we get asked is, what is a DADU? What is an ADU? And, what does that mean to me, right? People are very interested in, exploring the option of expanding their current footprint of their home, whether it be for rental purposes or moving in, family members. You have a kid that's about to go off to college, but they're not actually leaving, and they're going to school locally.
Yeah.
Where do you put them? So
yeah, and it's so expensive to kids. It's like, how do we afford a house?
Right.
So that's another big thing. And also in the state of Washington, recently there's been so many regulations passed to promote that.
Yeah.
Which is great. So it's not the same conversation that you would have 5 years ago. And now things changed.
Yeah.
So we'll get into those topics and hopefully help you figure out what to do.
All right, so ADU versus DADU, what's the actual difference between the two? So let's define the terms because they get used interchangeably.
Yeah.
And so let's just kind of clarify that first, right?
So ADU, which pretty much means that it's a dwelling unit, but it's attached to the existing structure. It could be one wall. It could be actually within the same footprint, and then you're subdividing within the footprint of the home. But it has to do with the existing structure, and this is really snugly attached.
Okay, yeah. So an ADU is basically, it's attached to the house. It's either going to be like a basement that you've converted, or maybe a garage, or maybe you're doing a small addition so that you can, add a
even larger additions. I mean, we've done a project that's like almost 1,600 square feet of addition. There's of course some regulations.
Right.
We'll get into those, but the bottom line is it needs to have at least one wall or roof or anything touching the existing big building. Yeah. The other term we have is DADU. So why don't you dive into that and explain a little bit, what is a DADU?
Yeah, so I mean, with DADUs, the regulatory situation with those is definitely more confined as far as what you can and can't do. And this does vary by city. Some cities are a little more friendly on the size of a DADU that you can do. So, a DADU being detached from the actual dwelling, it's a separate unit. And so in some areas, you might be limited to 1,000 square feet or, maybe even 700 in some. There are a few areas where you can go up to about 12 to 1,300 square feet on a DADU without getting a variance approved. But you are limited, with the ADU because it's attached to the property. It's definitely, or to the building. Sorry, it's definitely more friendly to expansion versus
expanding the house. Yeah, and that's another thing. In DADU, it sits by itself, individual, no connection to the house, which means it would need more things. So let's dive into those more things.
Well, now there's also a third category of DADU, which is what they call the junior ADU, and so that's basically an ADU that's within the dwelling, and so that's typically going to be something that's more confined, not necessarily going to have its own access. It's not going to have a private entrance or exit, but that is a third option where again you're definitely a little more likely to get approval on something like that. So the ADU, that's the most common. That's what people are most familiar with, right? So I figure we start there, kind of build off of that. You've heard them referred to as mother-in-law suites. A lot of times it's a basement that's been converted, and so you have the upper part of the home where the main living space is contained, and then you basically create another small apartment in the basement.
But it does have its own, a lot of times its own electrical. Right. So it has its own. So there's some division. So besides like mother-in-law suite, it can actually be as an apartment. So that's when we're talking about ADU, which is within the existing footprint, which is easier to convert in some cases. And the other option is it is attached. So let's talk about that one. So it shares a wall, but it's pretty much.
Yeah, and typically with these, you're going to have you're going to do an addition onto the existing building, and you have a shared wall, and there are some regulations as far as a fire barrier between those two structures. So even though it's still considered one structure for all intents and purposes, when you're talking about the fire rating, it is treated like a separate dwelling, and so you're literally just building off of that existing.
Yeah, in addition, actually, we're doing one in Lake Forest Park. We actually are running a separate water meter to it now because they just passed that like 6 months ago or something. So now it's its own electrical and its own water meter, which means it's basically your secondary home, and it needs to be. There's another regulatory, of course. It's it needs to be a little bit smaller. So there's a proportion of what the main home is versus maybe we want to call it a guest house, whatever, but it's a detached dwelling unit that focuses or functions like that. And yeah, it's great. What other people are doing too, maybe you can talk about it, is once they get built, right, they get them separated so you can resell them, but it's basically treated like an HOA. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so sometimes what people do is actually condoize the property, and with that, what they're doing is they're creating an HOA that controls the the land itself and what happens with the land, and so that way everyone that resides on this land has some sort of say in what happens to it, right? And then the HOA controls the land while you still own the actual structure itself. And so I've worked with investors that will build a DADU and they will condoize the property and then sell the DADUs separately.
It's 2 individual units.
Yes,
and that's for like investors, but also for homeowners. That's a great option if you have property enough to accommodate one. There are some regulatories and like how much land, how much square footage and so forth you need. But yeah, that's a great way of getting more value for your property. And then if you ever want to sell it.
Yeah. And one thing you do have to take into consideration is when you build a DADU on your property, there is a slight value loss on that original home. And so what you have to look at, you have to kind of look at it both ways, because if you're losing 3 or 4% on the value of your home by building this DADU, is the value of that DADU when you sell it going to offset the cost? And a lot of times it does. And that's where there is a huge advantage to condoizing the property and going that route.
And so which leads us to another question, is like cost, because that's going to be another thing. It's like, what does that look like to build one versus the other? If there's options, how do we decide? That would be a question. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a hot button. This topic here, I will say, it's a little muddy when you look online. There are some places that will advertise these low prices. Their square foot price to build is not taking into account the site work or the civil infrastructure needed for the electrical and plumbing connecting to the sewer. They're literally just throwing the number out there for the frame and the envelope. It doesn't take into consideration the types of finished materials, because if you're in a neighborhood where homes are selling for $500,000 to $600,000, obviously the finish level is going to be different versus if you're in a neighborhood where your homes are selling for $1.5 or $2 million. And so you really can't take those numbers and just apply them to your lot. I mean, the way the lot is set up makes a huge difference. The access, how far away from the sewer you are, where the power, does the power actually have to be upgraded from the pole? A lot of times they'll make you run a separate line, and so I've seen some people have to pay for the cost of adding an additional transformer or upgrading the existing one that's there. So it's really hard to put a number on it. The rough estimate, if all your site conditions are perfect and everything's basically in place,
which it's not.
Yeah, I mean,
it was in the perfect world.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, you could save $400 to $600 a square foot and be safe, but at the end of the day, it's like I've seen some go as much as $1,000 a square foot, and you really don't know, and that's why your site analysis and feasibility study is very important. Because
so let's talk about that, because a lot of people might not know. It's like, okay, because you think like, oh, construction costs, right? It's like, because we talk about square footage per building, but actually it takes the dirt. So like when you have a piece of dirt, either it's going to be a side yard or a backyard in a lot of scenarios for these units, it's not developed. So there's another question would be like, hey, if we do a smaller one, will that save us money?
Right.
We
yes and no, because
yes and no, probably a big no.
Yeah.
Because of the site conditions, and site condition means what it takes before we can even do foundation. That means what are we going to run to that junction, not junction, but to that meter, and how is it going to come in? We're talking gas, we're talking about electrical, and we're talking about sewer, right? And basically water. Like all those need to be connected. So
well, and then also let's park on sewer for a second, because I think we're missing something that's very important. Now, your non-permeable surface area for a lot actually makes a huge difference as to what you need to do infrastructure wise. And so when you talk about sewer, I mean, I'm pretty sure you were referencing the sewer for your waste, right? Well, you also have the storm sewer, and I've seen some situations where because of the area of roofing and driveway and sidewalks added, your non-permeable surface has reached a level now to where now you're required to actually connect to the storm sewer system and install all the infrastructure that goes along with that.
Yeah, so you threw another word here,
non-permeable surface.
I can't even get it out, right? That, like, explain, because people don't know what that means.
Yeah, and most people don't really consider this, because it shouldn't be on your radar. I mean, for us, this is where we live. When it rains, where does the water go? If you have a permeable surface, meaning gravel or grass or dirt, that water is absorbed by the ground, and so it dissipates on its own, and everything's good. Well, when you start putting in roofing, that roofing is going to catch all that water. It's going to channel it down to the gutters, and then the water has to go somewhere, right? And then you have your driveway. I mean, it's doing the same thing. It's catching it. It's running off the side. And then, your sidewalks do the same. And so you really have to consider, okay, how much non-permeable surface am I adding to my lot? Because once you get to a certain percentage of your lot space, you're cut off. I mean, they'll literally tell you no.
Yeah, it's like, that's it. That's all. And so those are all big things that need to be evaluated before even any design is really put. That's in terms, it's called site analysis, really, where we can look at codes, figure out what can be built, how much, what is going to be the square, like the coverage area, and that was what we're talking. And then we can, based on how big the home is, which is a big thing too. If it's like you can only add so much, your primary residence always needs to be bigger than the one that you're building to. So then if you have a small home, like maybe that's not a best solution. Maybe it's like, maybe you build a new home altogether as a primary with a DADU, and you like kind of gut it, or you take it to foundation, keep one wall, and it's still gonna be a remodel. But that's a different topic. But yeah, that's another qualification, is how big is your current home? So those are big things.
So I'd like to talk about the regulatory landscape and look at, the permitting, zoning, and just, I see a lot of projects get started and then stall out. And so what are some tips and, just advice you might be able to give our clients?
Yeah, having a good, like, it comes back to the team, right? Having a good team that will do all the research, up front. We do tell our clients, like, we had a client, we're like, hey, if we add this one more bathroom, like, this is going to trigger a whole set of stuff. Like, so there's enough warning in that where we can provide that information. And then the client needs to weigh out, is it really worth it? But knowing what it will trigger next. And it could be square footage, it could be additional appliance, it could be additional bathroom, that all of a sudden you can't connect to the existing maybe sewer line that's running next to the house. Now you have to connect all the way to the driveway, or there's like so many things that can trigger.
Yeah, because this project you're talking about, I mean, it's kind of similar to like a pool house. They didn't do a traditional DADU in the sense that there was no bedrooms. It wasn't somewhere they were going to live. It was more of an entertainment space. And so they were only about 50 feet from the home. Well, if they didn't add a bathroom, they could connect, they had sinks in there, but those sinks could connect to the existing line at the house. But because they wanted to add a bathroom to it, what ended up happening is they literally had to tear up their driveway, connect to the sewer line itself. And then now, because you tore up your driveway, now you got to report the concrete. And so, that one bathroom that, it wasn't necessary. Essentially added about 150 grand.
More. It was just like probably inside work alone. And then that's not like, so the cost of getting that bathroom, it would be the same as at that point, if you build entire, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, full kitchen, like it would not have changed. So knowing when you're looking into that, smaller is not always the best, depending on how much prep or site work you need to do. So that would be probably the conclusion, is you really need to evaluate how big of a building you're putting on, because if the costs on some of the prep work just can kill the project, or we did end up building it just added so much more cost that was not initially planned. So it does happen. Any other things, suggestions that we can say or maybe summarize for our viewers?
So I mean, I guess the biggest thing is just the most important thing to remember is, we're here to help. Get the information before you make a decision, because I mean, so often, it's going to make more sense to do one thing over the other, and it might not be obvious to someone who doesn't work with these every day. Sometimes it makes sense to just do an ADU, just expand off of the current home and do an attached dwelling unit. Other times, depending on what your plans are for the future, it might make more sense to do a DADU. But really, it's best to have the information so that you can make an informed decision.
Exactly. And so that's what we hope this video could provide for you guys as well, is really like a bit of insight of what to expect, what questions to ask, where to go and look for help. So hope this helped. Thank you for watching and being with us, and until our next episode.
This is Before You Build. See you next time.